Today on The State of Us, the old American right and Republicans' rift with big business as they attract parents. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by the one and only, the friendly redneck liberal and senior resident historian here at True Chat, an educator of 35 years and counting, Mr. Lance L. Jackson. We'll see how friendly he is today as we dive into our discussion about how the Trump GOP resembles the party of Calvin Coolidge in its commitment to economic protection, restricted immigration, and non-intervention abroad. The dispute with Disney in Florida reflects a wider rift between Republicans and big companies, as reported by the Wall Street Journal. And the reopening of schools is driving frustrated parents toward the GOP, also reported by the Wall Street Journal. Got a lot to talk about today, but we couldn't possibly begin that conversation, Lance, unless, of course, we have a word of the day.
4 syllables. Adjective, desultory. Desultory, D-E-S-U-L-T-O-R-Y, means passing from one thing to another in an aimless way, disconnected, not methodical, lacking direct relevancy, random, incidental. But, that's these people. It's like, oh, what do I do? Where do I go? I don't know. I'm a Democrat, but I don't like this, but I don't like these things of the Republican Party. And the Republican Party saying, well, we were this way and then we were that way, and now we're going to go back to this way. Just kind of that desultory way, winding their way down the path, aimlessly disconnected, wondering who's going to step out and speak for the party. Or will it be former President Trump?
That's the question, right? I'm not sure anybody has a definitive answer yet.
Even within the Republican Party, right? They don't know. They don't, some of the Republican Party want President Trump to be around, and others are saying, oh, please go away so we can take the party a different direction. And then you have, as these articles point out, people who have been Democrats and are very liberal in their abortion and gun rights and gender rights, starting to vote Republican because of what's going on in the schools and, the masking and those kinds of things. So it's a real desultory time here where people are just wandering through the forest trying to figure out, who do I support? What issue is the most important to me, and what direction do I want the country to go?
So we're going to kind of break it down. There's 3 articles, sort of 3 topics, and they pull together nicely. The first one we're going to talk about is how the Disney dispute is reflecting a wider rift between Republicans and big companies. Then we'll look at how the reopening mess with schools has driven frustrated parents toward the GOP in the second segment. And then we'll wrap it up with a little history lesson on the return of the old American right and how much of this probably could have been predicted for people that are students of history, as I'm sure our audience is. So first up, executives speak out on political and cultural issues, according to the Wall Street Journal. Some Republicans are drawing a sharper line and are leaning less on corporate donors. Disney is hardly alone in recent years in taking public stances, often against Republican-backed measures on behalf of or under pressure from its workers. In some instances, CEOs have said they feel obliged to speak on important issues such as gender or race. After the January 6, 2021 riot at the U.S. Capitol, a number of companies paused donations to Republican lawmakers who objected to ratifying electoral votes for President Biden. The Disney dispute, for those that don't know, when a new Florida law was being debated, Disney had remained silent, which is typically Disney's stance on most political issues, but under increasing pressure from workers, eventually decided to take a stance and come out basically saying, that they felt that this bill could hurt members of the LGBT community. So, and then that, of course, sparked a retaliation from some Republicans in the state who have threatened to take away Disney's special taxing district for its parks in Florida. And since then, Disney has remained a good bit more quiet, probably hoping that it will go away.
Well, it goes back to, I think, fundamentally what we talked about before, and that is in this jobs crunch that we're involved in, where there aren't enough unemployed people to fill all the job openings. If you don't, especially in the younger group, if as a company you don't speak to the political demands of your employees, they will look elsewhere, because to that millennial and younger worker, this is important to them. These life choices, these political battles are important to them. And if you as a company, as we've studied and read in the past, don't react accordingly, they will go look for another job. And in this job market, they can look for another job. And if you're a corporation like Disney or Coca-Cola or American Airlines, these big, huge corporations that need thousands and thousands of workers, if you don't respond to the demands of your workers, you may be looking, you may be shorthanded. And if you're shorthanded, you're not making any money. So, but again, that's also part of power to the people, right? I mean, as a worker and a voter, we say get involved. And so it's like, I'm going to put this pressure on my company. And the company then has to, maybe take a hard swallow and say, well, I guess we're going to have to step up to the plate and say this. And then, of course, the politicians then respond and say, hey, wait a minute. If you're going to give me a hard way to go, I'm going to make your life miserable. That's the way the game's played. And we're watching it play out. It will be interesting to see where it ends up, because we're still we haven't entered the midterm elections yet. I mean, we're having primaries in some states, more states to follow. But come this November, what's going to be the makeup of Congress? And what will that mean for each party? Because they're both playing out their hands and their chips as we speak, and people are voting, and they're divided on how they should vote, because the parties are divided on how they're handling each and every issue.
Yeah, I think part of what we're seeing, right, is Disney is just one example of this increasing trend that Lance is sharing with us. And Pew Research Center has conducted a survey recently that shows that the share of Republicans who say big companies have a positive impact on the way things are going in the United States has dropped 24 percentage points between 2019 and 2021. I mean, think about that. 24 percentage point drop in a 3-year span.
According to Republicans.
Right.
So typical Republican voters are saying big businesses aren't important to them anymore.
They asked Republicans, are big companies having a positive impact on the way things are done in the U.S.? In 2019, 54% of Republicans said yes. In 2021, only 30% agree. A 24 percentage point drop. And among Democrats, for whom attacks on companies have long been more common, positive views of big business has actually gone up. It's gone from 23% in 2019 to 28% in 2021. So not nearly as big of an increase, but you are actually seeing, as Republican voters in large numbers are backing away from saying that big business has a positive impact on the direction of the United States, more Democrats are likely to say that big business does have a positive impact. And I think that speaks to, Lance, right, not just the business issue, but a larger shift that I think we've been talking about for years on The State of Us, which is how the parties are in the midst of restructuring their priorities, what they're focused on, what who their base truly is, which is an item of contentious discussion, especially depending on where in the country you live, what your base looks like. So really it's, yes, Disney is an example, but it speaks to a larger departure of the Republican Party from a long held over the past few decades. And the article specifically talks about, right, the party of Reagan, both Bushes, John McCain. That is not really what the Republican Party looks like today.
They're going for the more middle class, lower class voter than what we all grew up thinking, at least in my generation, the Republicans stood for. But just a quote here from our local senator, Sherrod Brown of Ohio. He said, really, there's no genuineness to it. They talk about, they're not interested with big business and we can, and he goes, every time I say, okay, well, support the child tax credit and we'll pay for it by just slightly edging up the corporate tax or the upper level after it was dramatically brought down 5 years ago by President Trump. And Republicans answer Sherrod Brown and say, well, I'm sorry, we can't go there. So they claim that they don't have the ties to big business, that big business isn't as important as it used to be. But when Sherrod Brown says, well, let's support the child tax credit, for instance, and we'll pay for it, why are you going to pay for it? We'll pay for it. We'll raise the tax on corporates that was dropped historically by President Trump. And Republicans go, nah, we can't do that. So are they wedded to big business still? And this is just a ploy to get the middle class and lower middle class voters? And I say that because Mitch McConnell, famous Republican senator from Kentucky, raised in 2020, his 2020 campaign, raised almost $28 million from donors who gave $200 or less. His two previous races in 2008 and 2014, he raised about slightly under $1 million from donors who gave $200 or less.
Well, I think it speaks to they're in the midst of an identity crisis, right? They're starting to say things, and from a perhaps public perspective, they're attempting to shift their platform. But it's also important to note that a lot of these Republicans were around, right, for some of those Republican years of Bush and McCain. And so it's also tricky because it's like, well, we were part of that party. So I think there's that internal component too of, I may be willing to start to say I'm changing my stance, but then in reality, have I really actually willing to take those steps? And I think that's part of what we're going to have to see continue to play out is, will this rift that has started to form with big business, at least from what they say, actually play out in what Republicans start to do? Let's talk about, though, why frustrated parents, some of whom are Democrats and independents, have turned toward the GOP, at least on matters of school reopening. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. COVID restrictions weighed heavily on Democratic voters who say their party officials left mandates in place too long, with devastating consequences for their children. One parent says that they are so disillusioned. It's almost like, Lance, they feel like their Democratic leaders have a sort of desultory mood about them and presence. That they're not really paying attention or really in tune with what voters are telling them and wanting to see from them. And there's an interesting story about Democrat Jennifer Loughran spent the pandemic's early days sewing face masks for neighbors. Last month, as a newly elected school board member, she voted to lift the district's mask mandate. That came 4 months after she voted for the state's Republican candidate for governor. After a months-long political identity crisis, Ms. Loughran decided her opposition to her party's mask mandates, economic restrictions, and school closure policies outweighed her support for positions on climate change, abortion, and gay rights, at least for the moment. So she watched her daughter kind of fall behind in virtual kindergarten. She got frustrated not knowing when her children would get to return to the classroom, and she joined a group that attracted right-leaning parents in its school's reopening push. She was unhappy with her state's governor that they didn't fight to reopen schools sooner, and associated fellow Democrats with mask mandates and restrictions. And she's not alone, because the party out of power, as we know, does typically win during midterm elections, but public opinion surveys signal that trend is holding firm, as a Wall Street Journal poll taken in March showed that 46% of U.S. voters plan to back Republican candidates for Congress, while 41% say they'll support Democrats. On the pandemic, the Journal poll showed that voters believe Democrats were best able to get the pandemic under control by a 9 percentage point margin, but that was down from 16 points just 4 months prior.
As far as education is concerned, I think the problems that parents and society are finding in education have been there. The pandemic has just exposed them for the masses to see, and that's a whole nother issue and episode. But to the point, 2 years later, I think obviously people, there's this pandemic fatigue that is out there, and that's real. But as we speak, the numbers of COVID cases in the United States is skyrocketing again, and so are hospitalizations. And we know the trend for the last 2 years has been more cases, more hospitalization, followed by more deaths. Now, they're saying that this new variant will spread more rapidly, but it shouldn't cause as many deaths. If that's true, then I think we'll lead ourselves to more opening and to what they said, a year and a half ago, and that is this will become like the seasonal flu, and it will kill people, who are immune deficient and have breathing issues and things like that, just like the flu did. Nobody ever paid attention to it. We may be reaching that point. But again, if hospitalizations lead to a high increase of deaths, I don't know what that's going to do. Are we going to go back to mask mandates or try to? Are people just going to say, yeah, well, I don't care anymore and just let people die? I don't know, but it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out this summer, that we are seeing more cases, we are seeing more hospitalizations. Will the deaths follow, or are the variants getting weaker? Are the vaccines working? Or have there been enough people sick, to create a herd immunity? All of these theories that have been thrown out for the last 2 years, I think we're going to come to some kind of realization this summer and this fall and see where it goes. But it is interesting that we have seen politicians make the coronavirus a political issue. Well, we need to educate our kids. Well, okay. Yes. As a former teacher, putting kids in person will help learning, but that is not the systemic problem facing schools. And we're seeing that. Is there some growth? Yes. There is been some growth in the studies that show since in-person learning, students are learning better, but they're still learning at a much lower rate than they did a decade ago, even being in person. So again, being in person is not the panacea. It's not going to solve the problem of educating these children because, in my opinion, there's a more systemic problem to the way we educate children in America today.
One of the Democrats' failures is been in acknowledging, right, the frustrations of rural voters, of trying to speak to them and make them feel heard. And regardless of whether or not Republican policies are actually benefiting rural voters, the one thing that Trump tapped into, and many people like him, were finding those frustrations and vocalizing them. And I just thought it was interesting, as we have talked about that over time. Bridgewater is in New Jersey's 7th congressional district. It's represented by a Democrat. And he said, there has been a lot of frustration over the impact on families and kids staying home that some Democrats were slow to recognize. It's natural and fair to hold the party in power accountable for what happens in this country. And part of what I think he's getting at there is that it's not that what Democrats were saying about what had to happen and be done was necessarily wrong. I don't think he's saying that. I think he's saying there was a failure, which the Democrats have been guilty of in many respects, to recognize the frustrations that parents were having with watching as their children fell behind in school, not knowing, what to do about it, and feeling like there was no recognition, of Democrats pushing facts. But then when facts were presented about, how dangerous it was or wasn't to children and whether or not that was or wasn't acceptable risks. I think a lot of voters felt like they just kind of got the brush off, right?
If you give, as a politician, you give lip service to their complaints or their worries or their fears, and I talk about other problems that they don't have, they're going to vote for you, even though you don't follow through on it as a politician and actually do things for them. If you say, I hear you and these things need to be addressed, then you gain their support. I think you're right. I mean, if that's what you're saying, I think you're right, because if you look, okay, the Republican Congress, you can say whatever you want, but the facts do not bear out that Republicans did anything for the lower classes. Yet they have the support of these people because they talk to the issues that are important to those people.
Well, and in this case, the one thing they can point to is obviously a lot of Republicans did lift or never, really fully put in place mask mandates, but it became kind of a single issue thing. And yes, I think to your point, Lance, that's not just politics, right? Psychology backs that up. Study after study in life. If you take time to listen to someone, and I use air quotes there, folks, because we could debate what actually means listening. If you take time to make someone feel like you have listened to them, and you take time to speak back to them what you have heard from them, people are far more likely to go along with you, regardless of what you actually end up doing, right? I mean, it is... And that it sounds, all negative, but I mean, there's a lot of leadership stuff that tells you that, when you're leading a team or working with a lot of people, of course, they usually advocate that you should genuinely listen and consider what people put forward. And I'm not sure that our politicians on either side of the aisle really actually give a damn what we say or if they really listen to us. But again, it has more to do with the person who's complaining. Do they feel like they've been heard? Republicans were saying, look, hey, yeah, we're frustrated too. We think this is a bunch of crap. Your kids aren't getting educated. They ought to be back in school. And, masks are bad. And again, a lot of voters, I don't think initially felt that way, right? But as time has worn on, more people start to feel, again, that pandemic fatigue. And then as they hear people saying that, it's like, well, we gotta move up and on. We gotta get these kids educated. We can't lose any more time, this, that, and the other, right? So I do think, Lance, that's I don't know how big, but I think it's a very substantial portion of what plays into these voters who feel, again, torn because their party's not acknowledging it. And I think that's a fault of Democrats failing to, if you at least just said that you're hearing these things and that, you're going to work on trying to figure out a way to balance these expectations. You have a lot of voters who feel strongly about where Democrats are on climate change or where they are on gay rights or abortion. But then they're looking at it and saying, my congressperson's only going to be there 2 years. And if that's what gets education back on track, then maybe I'm willing to set aside those longer term concerns for what I need in the short term.
It definitely puts people on that desultory political path. They're just wandering aimlessly around saying, what do I do? I feel I agree with this party on this issue, but I agree with this party on these issues. And now I have to vote for which one of these issues affects me the most right now. I think that's what's going on.
So we've talked about kind of this rift between Republicans and big companies, this school reopening mess, and how it has driven voters toward, or driven frustrated parents toward the GOP. How do they tie together? And what does history tell us? Well, we're going to turn to our senior resident historian here and see if he can tell us about the return of the old American right. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. The Trump GOP resembles the party of Calvin Coolidge in its commitment to economic protection, restricted immigration, and non-intervention abroad. So Lance has said for, I don't know, probably the last decade that we've been doing this show, what's old is new again. And there is nothing that anybody can ever do that hasn't already been done or similarly themed or spoken about in the past. So today, as we have discussed a few of the items about where the Republican Party stands, I think it's important to talk about where the Republican Party has been historically and say, is any of this really new? We've talked, the party of Reagan, the party of both Bushes, the party of John McCain. It's damn near gone. But there was something before that, wasn't there, Lance? There were Republicans before those people, and they weren't the same.
No, and you go back to the Republicans, if you want to, refer to themselves as the party of Lincoln, who was a strong, defender of personal rights and got rid of
social justice
and fought a war, to keep a country together. So, there is a long history of Republican. And Republicans in the 1920s, we were coming out of World War I, and we had, the influenza pandemic, and you had the...
Wait, there's been other pandemics, Lance? This isn't the first one ever in all of history?
No, it's not.
Oh, okay. Unprecedented.
Oh, okay.
This unprecedented pandemic. Oh, okay.
And
it's not unprecedented.
There was a post-war recession, and these Republicans, Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge, of the early 1920s. Harding was elected in 1920, but then the zero factor. Harding did not finish his term in office, and Calvin Coolidge took over and continued on, but basically won. Their policy returned to normalcy. We're going to go back to the way it was because, we can always turn back the clock and, let's make America great again, right? I mean, I'm just drawing the parallels. We're going to return to normal. 2020, we're going to make America great again, meaning we're going to go back to the way it was when it was good.
But these guys in 1920 were talking about normalcy, right?
Yeah, that's my point, is that was their campaign, return to normalcy.
And they liked the ideas of the American First Committee.
Right, meaning we're not going to have any immigration. We're not going to worry about anybody overseas. We're going to take care of America first. And
so Donald Trump didn't come up with
we're going to stop immigration because, it's great that everybody's here that's already here, but we don't have room for any more. And I was said 100 years ago, and they passed Harding and Coolidge passed two of the strictest immigration laws. They basically stopped immigrants coming into the United States until after World War II. Low taxes, economic protection. We can't. We gotta tax the Chinese. We got to do what we can to the Chinese because and we're going to raise tariffs on everybody's goods and force everybody to buy American, and all of those ideas are from the 1920s. So almost anything that the article states here is saying, almost everything that President Trump ran on is you can go back to Harding and Coolidge and its basis is there. How did that work out? Well, we went into an economic depression and we were slow to react to get into World War II. And it created a stronger federal government under FDR because people said, we need help. And it's been something that the right and the Republicans have been fighting against for the last 50 years, is that government control that was created when, everything's wonderful. We're going to be hands off and things will get, just continue to run its course. And nothing bad will happen. And we're just going to protect our borders. And we're going to, only fight if we get attacked. And, that happened. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Even Charles Lindbergh, the America First leader, said, I guess we have to go to war now. And when we did declare war on Japan, since Japan had an alliance with Germany, Hitler declared war on the United States a few days later. And now America's in the war. And the America First just kind of dissolved. It's like, everything we stood for didn't happen. So we're just going to disappear now. Leaving a new Republican Party to try to take on the government state of the Democrats and FDR with Robert Taft and some other people. But basically, as the article points out, the Republicans lost power. They were in the wilderness for 40 years. They had dominated politics since the Civil War. And when they took this non-imperialist idea and ran with it and just said, we're going to close the borders and come in and take care of ourselves, it put them in the political wilderness for the next 50 years after that, until you get to Ronald Reagan. You know, you have a little bit of respite there with Eisenhower, and then a few years later with Nixon, but basically the Democrats controlled World War II, you know, through the 80s until you get to Reagan.
Well, and the Republicans, Coolidge and Harding's positions in the early 1900s obviously gave way to FDR and arguably the single largest expansion of the federal government in American history. So the other lesson, right, if you're
Social Security,
conservative listening,
you know, minimum wage,
right,
40-hour work week, all of these things that we count now as, well, that's always been around. No, again, it hasn't. It was created during the Great Depression in the late 1930s, the Fair Labor Standards Act, you know, and Social Security, all of that was created in the late 30s because it was a public outcry from the Great Depression.
Well, and Taft, as he put it in 1938, right, basically after they had lost power, the regulation of wages, hours, and prices and practices in every industry is something which, in effect, socialism, which is government regulation of the worst sort, which means a totalitarian state. Now, of course, this is after they're out of power, but to the point of it was viewed at the time, right, as a, I mean, again, think of the name. So often I feel like we overcomplicate things. The New Deal, right? Well, what does that mean? It meant that it was a new deal for the American worker, for the American people, and for the American way of life. It was, you know, the old deal's no good. And so we have to rethink all this. And like it or not, the rethinking certainly did move us more toward away from total free market and more toward government control, which, yes, you know, certainly shares similarities with socialism. But to the point of today, we just all take that for granted because it's just part of life. And it's hard to imagine a world where that's not the case, where there are no minimum wages and where there are no restrictions on how many hours you can work or how you can treat workers, or, you know, that for so many of us where there is no Social Security and it's just up to you to work until you die or, you know, hope that your family can take care of you. Those are all things that we just accept as part of American life. But for well over a century, those were not at all part of American life.
Well, before the New Deal, there was no government bailout during a recession.
It just happened.
Recessions occur. That's part of capitalism. Recessions and depressions. If you study history, every 15 to 20 years, there was a recession or a depression, and still are in our mostly capitalist society, but always were since, you know, George Washington and the founding fathers. That's just a natural occurrence in this economic system. What happened with the New Deal was, okay, when we have those, the government's going to step in and help you out. And that's what we've seen, right? The bailout in 2007 of the banks because they were too big to fail, the government bailout to help smooth the economy, to smooth the landing. So more Americans weren't thrown out of their homes and businesses and things like that. The coronavirus bailouts, you know, people getting money for just because from the government twice, businesses getting money from the government, all because, well, if we just let it happen, if there's no government intervention, it's going to be a lot worse than it was. Now, it doesn't mean it wasn't bad, okay? But
it could have been worse.
But it could have been worse. And the government stepped in and kind of
flattened the curve
and made things a little bit better. And that goes back to FDR, you know, with this new deal, this new contract between the government, the federal government, and the American people. And now we just expect it. Well, things are rough. Oh, you know, and we see it now with, well, you need to, you know, take away my student loans because I went to college and I'm not making any money now. So, well, the government needs to bail me out because I'm in a tough way. Well, that's because that's what we've done since the 1930s and we've become accustomed to it. But that doesn't mean it's always been that way.
Yeah, I think the lesson to take away from this in my mind, right, is that there's a lot of people out there who might be looking at, the position the Republicans are in and with the election of Trump in 2016 and say, this is really a time for Republicans, right, and Republicanism. I think that upon closer inspection, though, what history would tell us is the last time that something like this happened, Republicans' philosophy, was pretty desultory in its seeming like it was the right thing, but then in reality proving to be, not methodical at all and disconnected from the realities of the world. Maybe not the pulse of the people, but the realities of the world. And those catch up with us one way or another. And that is part of why Democrats, wrestled control away from them and held on to it for the better part of 40 years. And I think that is the message then to those out there listening. If you're a Democrat, maybe you take that as good news. If you're a Republican, this is an opportunity to steer your party in a direction that doesn't result in the loss of control. Again, most of us didn't live through 40 years of Democratic control, so we don't really appreciate that that's how it was, but it pretty much was. So the question is that what any of us want? And the good news is that if we don't want it, there's things we can do about it.
Choices, right? That's the big thing about being an American. We have choices.
Oh, boy. Leave us with that one, Lance. Speaking of choices, let us know about what you think of our conversation today. Send us email podcast@thestateofus.org. We'd like to hear from you. So why do we have this conversation today, Lance?
Well, we're glad that you made the choice to listen to us today, and we do this because True Chat has a mission. Our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we've had one of those today. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have, share it with your family and friends. And when they say, well, where are you hearing these guys? It sounds like something that would be interesting to me. Well, tell them as a podcast, they can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us can be heard Tuesday and Thursday mornings as a podcast. We're also heard on the weekends on AM and FM radio stations across the country. What do we have today for the victor, Lance?
Recognition that they won.
Yeah. So who was our victor?
Who was the victor?
Who was?
I thought I sneaked one out.
Oh, you did?
Even though you came on there at the end. I thought I had built up a commanding lead.
Oh.
But
okay.
I mean, we'll leave it. I had it like 4-3 me, but we'll see. I don't know. What'd you have?
Well, see, I thought it was 4-3 me. So we'll leave it to the ultimate referee.
To the referee, Bradley Butch. Will decide who wins based after he gets done editing. Who wins?
Yes. And I think we all know
how that's going to play out.
In Bradley's words, how that will end up. So,
because Lance will never listen, and so I can do whatever I want to with his words.
For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to Bradley Butch, that producer that we have aforementioned, and thank you, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.